Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Sorry we weren't able to get Jim up live on the Facebook page, but we've got him here on Zoom. And so we're going to post this on all of our channels and via email for you all to see. My name is Rob Simmelkjaer. Thank you very much for joining us. As you may know, I'm a Westport resident, a proud constituent of Congressman Himes. I'm also considering a run for Secretary of the State of Connecticut, but this broadcast, this conversation with Congressman Himes has nothing to do with that. This is just a constituent talking to Congressman Himes. This is not an endorsement or anything like that from the Congressman. And Jim, again, thank you very much for taking some time to chat with me about this today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me, Rob.
So, just briefly, we were saying before about the significance of this day. And I think about 4 days in my life that I'll never forget where I was as an American. The day of the Challenger disaster back in the 1980s when I was a kid. Then, of course, 9/11, the Sandy Hook shooting for me, which was quite visceral, and January 6, 2021. The thing that was most tragic about that last event was that it was really, not a threat or an attack from outside. It was the United States at war with itself. And you were in the building that day. You can speak to that day in ways that no one else can. Can you speak a bit about what it was like? What stands out most to you, most viscerally to you as a memory that you have from that day?
Yeah, great question, Rob, and thanks for having me. And let me answer that question. I've got two answers to that question, one of which I think is more interesting than the other. But I should say right up front that what worries me most, of course, is what happened after that day. I don't think we learned the lessons. I think many of the forces that led to that day have only gotten stronger. But I know we'll come to that. So let me answer your specific question. First of all, and less interestingly, massive failure of security. I had always assumed that there was some big red button somewhere that somebody pushed, and the whole Capitol was locked down and everybody was safe and secure, even against coordinated terrorist trained people. Well, no, that turns out not to be the case. Massive, massive security failure, right? But the second and maybe most interesting thing that was shocking is what you were getting at in your introduction there, which is the force of Donald Trump's lies. And it wasn't just Donald Trump, right? It was the whole Rudy Giuliani and, senators who were sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. The force of that lie convinced, and let me be clear here, there were some very bad people that broke into the Capitol that day. But I was there, and I will tell you that most people that day weren't 3%ers or Proud Boys or fascists. Most people were dupes who just really came to believe that their democracy had been stolen. And that's pretty shocking in and of itself. It's particularly shocking, and I'm not sure that I understand it to this day. It's particularly shocking when you reflect on the fact that there wasn't a single fact. There wasn't a single court case. There were 60 plus court cases. There was nothing that added even a shred of evidence to the notion that what Donald Trump was saying was true. But the desire to believe it was so intense that people who you might meet in a Starbucks, who I think would tell you, we back the blue, were picking up fire extinguishers to try to break the skulls of police officers, to get into the Capitol, to hurt members of Congress, to stop a constitutional process. To this day, it's hard for me, maybe as a sort of analytical guy, to understand how that much of how somebody's sentiments and beliefs can be so warped.
That really, to me, Congressman Himes, is the fundamental, not just source, but the lesson from that day and all the days that have followed it, which is this question of truth and what is known, what is knowable by people. There were people I spoke to and communicated with leading up to that day, who it turned out were there, at least in Washington at the rally, if not in the building. And I remember this ongoing impossibility that I sensed of being able to get them to accept these facts, right? The fact that the election wasn't stolen, the fact that this was a fair and free election. And there was simply no way to get them there. And it was that group, and studies have shown, as you pointed out, that it was mostly people like that, not members of right-wing extremist groups that were in the building. They were the ones who really made that event what it was. And so, Congressman, what do we do about that? How do we solve a problem like that in an age where there is so many sources of information out there that people can choose from?
Yeah, gosh. could spend an hour or two or three on that topic alone. I think we need to start with a premise. I did a little Q&A Facebook Live of my own, and I was just taking questions from constituents. We need to start with the premise, which is that the political leadership of this country, we can help, but we can't fix this problem. We're a democracy, which means that the sort of fundamental unit that either makes it work or not work is the individual citizen. And I was trying to make this point to somebody. Somebody had some incredible paragraph of misinformation that I was sort of struggling with, that Donald Trump offered up the National Guard and then Nancy Pelosi said no. Those two things couldn't be further from the truth. But my point is this, which is that to some degree, we're going to have a democracy if we deserve it. And if we have let ourselves become a people to which the facts and evidence are unimportant compared to our desires, our tribal affiliation, we'll lose our democracy. And, democracy is not something that we get handed. It is something that we work for every day, and it can be uncomfortable. It means that no matter who you are, by the way, you and I both lean left, we have an obligation to expose ourselves to ideas that contradict our own. That's good citizenship. So I think a lot of this relates to what do we think our obligations as citizens of the greatest democracy human history has ever produced are. They're serious and they're real. And if we don't abide by them, we'll get the system we deserve. One last thought, Rob, and I don't want to speechify here because there's just so much to unpack. But one thing I know for sure, and let me say this carefully because I tick people off if I don't say it carefully. There needs to be accountability. And in particular, there needs to be accountability, not just to the dupes who showed up at my workplace on January 6th, but to the mastermind, to the Donald Trumps, the Michael Flynn's, the Rudy Giuliani's, all those people. And by the way, including some senators and others who were perpetrating this notion that there are irregularities in voting in Florida or Ohio. But one thing, so there has to be accountability. But here's the controversial point. We have a project of national reconciliation that we have to do. And that doesn't mean that you or I need to get comfortable being in the room with Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's not what I'm saying. And in fact, I will look to finish my career without ever having that happen. But we have an obligation to think about people on the margin, to think about people who are persuadable, people who think today that you and me, in virtue of being Democrats, are communists, that we're evil, worse than communists, that we're evil. We need to do our part to take down that tribalism, that level of anger and intensity. The answer is there is a place for outrage, but if we're going to restitch our democracy, it's going to be because we start listening to each other. We start taking our obligations to each other, our obligations to the truth more seriously.
Talking about accountability, let's just talk a bit about what's actually happening in the House right now to try to bring some accountability. The bipartisan commission on the January 6th attack is doing its work. What do you think the ultimate outcome, but more importantly, impact of that work can possibly be? I know one of your best friends in the House, Janie Raskin, who of course was an impeachment manager as well, sits on that committee. It's bipartisan, but I think we can say not broadly so, right? A couple of Republicans on there who are the Republicans like Liz Cheney, who have been sort of excommunicated from the party, essentially. Can the commission bring any real accountability, or is this just going to be an exercise with a bipartisan stamp, but one that ultimately is just going to be seen as political by those who choose to see it as such?
Yeah, great. And I hope we can come back to Liz Cheney because there's a lot to unpack there with those two, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. But to answer your question, as you know, there's sort of two mechanisms for accountability. One is the largest Department of Justice probe ever that has resulted in 700 people that assaulted the Capitol that day being charged with a variety of offenses. And I won't go into what Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, said yesterday, but he gave me some confidence that he understands that it's not just about the little folks who broke windows at the Capitol. As he put it, he's going up as high up the ladder as he needs to go and as he can go. And I think that's really important because at the end of the day, look, let's make no bones about this. Donald Trump is responsible. He is responsible for this. And it will be hard if history doesn't look back and say that when a president of the United States denied the legitimacy of his own victory and nothing happened, that is not a good historical record, which leads to what you were asking about, which was the role of the House Select Committee. And, here, what a tragedy that, the Republicans decided not to play. Why they don't see authoritarianism and eroding democratic norms as a danger to them as much as Democrats see it as a danger to the republic is beyond me. Maybe worth even some conversation. But two things are going to happen with that. Number one, they're already uncovering remarkable facts. The war room that Steve Bannon was running at the Willard, the text that Don Jr. was sending to the White House saying, get the president to stop this. They have already told a story of how absolutely panicked the people that we think of as the enablers of the right, the Don Jr.'s, the Sean Hannitys of the world, how much they were panicked by what was happening. So they're already telling a story, and that story will be really important to history. And by the way, the accountability of history is important here, right? Nobody raises their hands today and say, I loved what Joe McCarthy was doing in the 1950s. That's important. But of course, Congress will, if they uncover evidence of crimes, there will be referrals made to the Department of Justice, and those referrals will hopefully result in prosecution.
And then, and we're going to have a former federal prosecutor join me in a moment to talk about some of the prosecutorial stuff that Merrick Garland stood to speak about yesterday. But let's go to the root of the Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger conversation, because we talk about accountability, and here are two of the handful, a dozen or so Republicans who were willing to stand up moments after these attacks and speak about what happened and how wrong it was. And there were more of them that day on January 6th than there were a month or two later when there was an impeachment proceeding underway. Somehow magically, a number of them disappeared between January 6th and impeachment. Republicans were willing to speak candidly about this. But these folks now, Kinzinger, Cheney, they're on the margins at best of the party. Politics is a career, Jim, and people don't want to do things to harm their careers typically. So if that's the evidence, if the evidence is you stand up against someone like Donald Trump and it hurts you, what's the lesson then? And how can you blame Republicans for doing the things they're doing?
Yeah, it's it's sort of hard to blame representatives for reacting to what their constituents want. Now, it's beyond the scope of this conversation, but the Republicans who are standing up for Donald Trump, I think are by and large not standing up for what their constituents want. They're standing up for what the Republican primary electorate wants. And that's a very different group of people, even in red states. But anyway, that's beyond the scope of our conversation, but it's really important because it gets to who is being represented. And in our system today, sadly, it is all too often the primary electorates who tend to be activists, who maybe tend to be more on the fringes, who get played to. But I think, and this is actually what has been hardest for me. It's not the memory of the violence. Thank God I was not directly witness to brutal violence, but an awful lot of Republicans who I worked with and respected. I don't necessarily need you to go as far as Cheney and Kinzinger have, although I wish you would, because it's about our republic. It's not. I would love to have you count your own career as less important than the sort of bedrock of our democratic system. And sadly, too many of them have made the choice not to do that. But I do need you at least not to aid and abet, right? And again, let's keep the Matt Gaetzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greene, these entrepreneurs of tribalism, out of it. A system in which elected officials don't lead is a real problem. And I mean, it gets back to what we were talking about before. Again, yes, there is a strong desire on the part of elected officials to keep their jobs, but at what price? At what price? I mean, I give Adam Kinzinger a lot of credit for saying, hey, if I have to stand up for an autocrat who, wouldn't know the Constitution if it fell on his foot, maybe I just don't want to be part of this anymore. And why more people didn't do that, I don't know.
Let's talk about the key issue that, from a political and legislative point of view, is coming from what happened that day, which is voting rights and where we're going as a country when it comes to protecting the right to vote. There are a number of pieces of legislation that are out there now, a couple that have passed the House. Clearly, the Senate is the obstacle here. And so Leader Schumer is talking about bringing these things to a vote and ultimately bringing the question of the filibuster in the Senate to a vote. As the need for 60 votes is clearly an obstacle, if not the obstacle, to getting anything done when it comes to voting rights legislation. First of all, can you just briefly describe the pieces of legislation that passed the House and what they do, and then what the Senate is now poised to do with them?
Yep. Great question, and it's important to start from the Constitution, as in so many things. Like it or not, the Constitution vests the authority to determine the manner and timing of elections in state legislatures. So that's in the Constitution. You can look it up. So there is a limit to how specifically the federal government can determine the manner of elections. That said, as you pointed out, there are two bills. One is a fairly important bill following up on the Voting Rights Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act is taking the Supreme Court up on their invitation to modernize the Voting Rights Act. When they threw the Voting Rights Act out, they didn't throw the act out. They just said, time has passed, it's a different world. You guys need to come up with a different version, different geographies, et cetera. Well, we've done that through John Lewis. The second one, what's known as HR 1, is a broad variety of protections that would do things like require the disclosure of any foreign money that comes into our politics, that would prohibit measures that are taken to make it harder for particular populations to vote, certain elements of voter ID, that kind of thing, that would reverse the dramatic efforts that have been made in Republican-controlled states to make it harder to vote. Dialing back early voting, reducing the number of polling places. They do all that saying that, well, this is designed to prevent fraud. There is no fraud, Rob. I mean, are there isolated cases that you can count on two hands of individual voter fraud? Yeah, of course there is. But there is no systematic voter fraud. And so all of these measures, you say to yourself, well, why are they doing that? Well, go back to Georgia. When lots of people vote, it generates outcomes the Republican Party doesn't like. In Georgia, the Democrats won 2 seats, by the way, with an African-American and a Jewish guy. So what's going on here is very clear. And you asked, where is it going? There's a long conversation now with the filibuster in place on this stuff. It's going nowhere. Let me be blunt about that. There's no way you're getting 10 votes from the Republicans to move this forward. So now the conversation is, can the Democrats change the rules to eliminate the filibuster, at least for voting-oriented stuff? Now, two things to say about that. One, the filibuster is not constitutional. It's just a rule of the Senate. I happen to think it's a stupid rule. No other democracy demands supermajority voting to actually pass legislation, right? At least none that I'm aware of. The filibuster was put in as a Senate rule. There's nothing constitutional about it. And secondly, let's look at the history here. We've been eroding the filibuster for a long time, right? We started with Supreme Court justices don't need 60 votes, and then Mitch McConnell went to all judges don't need 60 votes. So, my hope, and it's going to be quite a squeeze through the usual Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, is that we can do away with the filibuster, at least for the purposes of fundamental mechanics of democracy stuff.
Some of the previous changes to the filibuster, particularly what Harry Reid did, limiting the filibuster to so the judicial nominations other than Supreme Court nominations didn't need 60 votes. A lot of folks feel that that change ended up backfiring somewhat on Democrats when the Republicans turned around and extended that to Supreme Court nominations. And that's how Trump was able to get through several nominees without any chance of getting 60 votes. Certainly all 3 of the Supreme Court nominations he got would not have gotten through had that rule not been changed. Are there unintended longer-term consequences to getting rid of the filibuster that concern you in a world where Democrats, which by the way could be a world coming quite soon, where Democrats are not in any sort of majority in the Senate or the House?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought a lot about it. And you're right, I got it backwards. It was Harry Reid first with regular federal judges, and then Mitch McConnell with Supreme Court. I got it backwards when I was talking about it. But look, there's no question that, live by the sword, die by the sword. In other words, if you think the filibuster is a bad idea, someday you're going to want to have a filibuster because you'll be in the minority. I'm comfortable with that, Rob. I've thought a lot about this. I'll tell you what makes me really angry about the filibuster. Less so that it, the supermajority concept is just, it stops us from doing a lot of important things. The reason I'm comfortable with the idea of get rid of the whole darn thing is the filibuster shields people like me from accountability. In other words, we get to run around saying all sorts of stuff that we kind of hope doesn't happen. And the example I would point out to you is the decade that the Republicans spent running around saying we need to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And 20 million Americans were covered under the Affordable Care Act. And I don't like admitting that I thought this way sometimes, but if they were ever, and then remember when they had the chance to do it, they didn't. But if they had done that and they'd thrown 20 million Americans off their health insurance over something that had been an article of faith of their party for a decade, they would have been obliterated. But instead, they were shielded from accountability. So what the filibuster really does is it encourages people like me, or more typically people like Ted Cruz, or whoever lives on the left, the sort of the more exuberant extreme of the Democratic Party, to say things that you really haven't thought through with respect to the consequences. So I'd be more comfortable in a system, though it would produce more policy volatility. There's no way to get around that. Kirsten Sinema is not wrong when she says that you could pass a law, requiring national voter ID. But look, let's have our government govern and our citizens hold our government accountable for the decisions that government makes.
Why isn't there a deal, Congressman Himes? Why isn't there some deal that could be struck when it comes to voting rights to give Republicans one or two things they want? And I'll let you go soon after this. I know you have to catch a flight, but Republicans, they want voter ID. They want voter ID across the board strengthened. They want certain so-called security measures in place. Is there no world in which they could be given a few of those things in exchange for some of the things that Democrats want to protect the rights, particularly of minority voters?
Well, yes and no. Look, my inclination, understanding our system as I do, is to always say we should look to compromise. I'm happy to compromise on things like tax policy, immigration policy, you name it, defense policy, surveillance policy. But really, you want me to compromise on whether we want a whole lot of Americans to vote or just a lot of Americans? That's hard.
Yeah.
Hard. I mean, let's make no bones about this, right? I mean, the notion that we need voter ID because there's so much rampant voter fraud. Look, if there were a voter fraud problem, I'd be much more willing to say, yeah, Rob, we ought to compromise on that. There are 1 million fraudulent votes in this country. That's a real problem. But Rob, as you and I both know, there's almost no fraudulent votes in this country. So
that's right.
Two things make it very hard to compromise on that issue, particularly when you know that in the background, and I wish we had a Republican on this conversation to rebut me if I'm wrong about this, but I really do believe that this is all part of an effort to try to reduce the size of the overall electorate. And let's just be blunt about that. Republicans would really like it better if communities of color, particularly African Americans who vote 90-10 or so for Democrats, young people who skew Democratic, they would be a lot happier if it was just really hard for those folks to vote. So all of those things combined to make this a pretty hard area in which to say like, oh, okay, we'll compromise.
It's hard. It is hard to think of a way to compromise, but unfortunately the lack of a deal is going to leave us in, unfortunately, the place where we're in now and where we appear to be heading, which is vastly different experiences as a voter, depending on what state you live in. And, we're relatively fortunate in a state like Connecticut, although we still have a ways to go. I mean, some of the legislation that passed in the House would change voting in Connecticut when it comes to minimum number of days of early voting and mail-in voting, things that we don't have now in this state. So, just like we have differing availability of things like abortion access and gun access in different states, we could be heading in that direction when it comes to voting as well.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's not okay, right? It's just not okay. We should be doing everything everywhere to make it easier for more Americans to vote. I mean, if your success relies on fewer people voting, you really got to think about that a little bit. There are places in the world you can go where that sort of political system obtains, but this ain't one of them, right? And so, yeah, look, and the last thing, let's just mention this before I go. The thing who knows how this is going to play out. I frankly hope that they get rid of the filibuster for this purpose and that we set a minimum baseline nationwide for ease of voting. But let's also not forget the real importance of continued mobilization and organization You and I are too young to remember a lot of the efforts that were coordinated in the 1960s, where people very literally lost their lives to fight for the right to vote. So we can't ever forget that, we can't predict perfectly what's going to happen within the structure of the law, but we have a lot to say about our own commitment to getting people registered, to getting them to the polls, to making people understand how important it is, particularly at this moment in our history, to make sure that their individual voices are heard.
All right. Well, Congressman Himes, thank you very much. I know this is a day I'm sure you're having a lot of conversations, and a day you won't forget, certainly from a year ago. Any last thing you want to say, just in terms of what you think, just a personal anecdote? I mean, what you most remember from that day that will really sort of you'll carry with you throughout the rest of your days in Congress and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll come back to a version of what I said when you asked that in the outset. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to reserve my condemnation for the ringleaders here, for the Trumps and the Giulianis and the Mark Meadows, the folks who really should have known better, who had an agenda. I saw a lot of those people on January 6th up close. When I was taken out of the chamber by the police officers, a lot of them were lying on the floor, spread eagled with guns trained on them. And I looked at a bunch of them, and, a lot of these folks were, I don't want to say you and me, because I'd like to believe that you and I wouldn't do that. But it pays to have a certain amount of humility about what you might and might not do. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of these folks are folks that, probably coach Little League and, support the League of Women Voters or whatever. And we just need to grapple with that, because if we start thinking of those folks as satanic, as fascists, as terrorists, I'll forgive you the emotional catharsis that comes from that. And by the way, I might even claim to have more of a claim to that emotional catharsis than most, having been there. But it doesn't advance the project of restitching the fabric in this country. So we've got to find a way, not with the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, let me be clear about that, but we've got to find a way to reduce the tribalism, to reach across, and to reestablish this sense that we're going to have really vibrant disagreements over policy, but that we're going to look at each other as Americans, not as fascists or communists or Soros people, but as Americans. And we've got a lot of individual work to do to get us more into that frame of mind.
All right, Congressman Jim Himes, thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it. All the best to you, and we'll see you out there in the Connecticut
Thanks,
4th District.
Take care. Happy New Year.
Take care.